Good morning. My name is Daniel Ludvigson. I am the superintendent of Long Prairie Gray Eagle. Didn't quite update this slide, so I'm not an elementary principal currently, but when I originally made this presentation, I was. And this one is about when you have those conversations, we need to talk. And for a lot of us, that phrase kind of triggers a sort of emotional response because that's usually code for we need to talk about something I'm not happy with. And it's primarily for those times when there's an unmet expectation. And how do you navigate those conversations to create stronger relationships, not destroy them? Because I like to say that if you can't handle the big conversations, it doesn't really matter how well you handle the little ones because all the work you do can be undone with one bad, crucial conversation. Um, so, first, to give credit where credit is due, these are my resources. Primarily take most of my content from the Crucial Accountabilities and Crucial Conversations. Oops. I took a little bit here from Now We're Talking, but that's mostly about evaluation resources, but both very good books. And I originally was trained on the Crucial Accountability and Crucial Conversations series by the ND Lead Center. So just a shout out to them. So, a crucial conversation really starts prior to the actual conversation. So, what I mean by that is your relationship with the individual involved has a pretty big impact on how the conversation will go. Basically, I kind of like to see it as how much wiggle room you'll get. Will the person make an assumption about an ill intent, or will they kind of give you some breathing room to explain yourself? And either with myself or if I'm trying to navigate a conflict with two other staff that I know, or parents and staff, whoever it is, I look for these four things to try to analyze why I think it might be going awry. Safety. If safety isn't present in a conversation, a relationship, people aren't going to want to talk. They're going to want to shut down. They don't feel comfortable sharing information. And that not wanting to share their true feelings or information can result in poor communication and be a big source of conflict. Respect. Respect is just the feeling that the other person doesn't respect their opinions, their knowledge, they don't have a lot of faith in their abilities, their competence, that sort of thing. And if somebody feels like they're not receiving respect or their opinions aren't respected, that sort of thing, that can be a big hang up in a crucial conversation. And you might need to restore that sense of respect. And then purpose. I feel like purpose for us in schools should be one of the easier items because we're all here for kids. And it's the one I most likely use when I'm trying to get two people on the same page. A lot of times I start with purpose. We're here to do what's best for kids, and let's get back to that. And then trust. And trust is more than just being able to trust what you say. There's also an element of being predictable, dependable, reliable, responsible, those sorts of things. Like people know what to expect from you. So trust doesn't necessarily mean they like you or that they like what you have to say, just that what comes out of your mouth that they can take at face value and what you'll do, like they can predict or anticipate. So trust is more than just what your words are. It's also like your body language and your actions over time. And that's why these four things, a lot of it is built up prior to the conversation. So crucial conversation skills aren't a substitute for good relationships. You still need to build those with people. And if you don't have those elements, sometimes you have to take a kind of a sidestep from the crucial conversation, focusing on issue per se or course of action and on repairing one of these four elements that might be damaged. So the first thing you need to do is identify if you're in it going into a crucial conversation or if it turned into one while you were having it. Not all crucial conversations we necessarily know we're heading into. But generally, they involve these three elements. One is obviously opposing opinions. Can't really have a crucial conversation if we all agree on it. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. High stakes. That means like what what happens is going to have a big impact. Kind of like high stakes testing, so to speak. But does the result of this conversation have a major consequence? For example, if you're having a meeting about a student's IEP, if this element of the behavior plan doesn't get hammered out, is the likely result that the child's not going to be able to stay in school, type of thing. Strong emotions. So high stakes and strong emotions don't necessarily go together. They typically do, but sometimes it's just a person's strong feelings. I remember having a conversation not too long ago, and I didn't think the issue was that big a deal. It had to do with payments on for students on a device of some sort. And I went to talk to a staff member who was assigning charges due to some damages they perceived. And when I was talking to them, they were visibly upset. And to them, it was producing a very strong emotion. And to them, it was very much, when I talked to them, I went back to it, it was a respect issue to them. And if the issue got handled in a certain way, they saw it as disrespect. And even though on my side of it, the stakes weren't high, for them, their emotions about the topic and what it meant to them made the issue into a crucial conversation. So the first thing you need to do is focus on you first. So I've done presentations over several years, and I like to write. And a lot of times when you give advice, a lot of times people will say things like, I know a person who really needs to hear this. And just take a minute to pause that if that's where your head is at, because the only person you control is yourself. So you need to spend time getting yourself right first. Unfortunately, we as human beings are not well designed for crucial conversations. When we have a high emotional response, as mentioned in the earlier slide, we tend to move from our prefrontal cortex down to our reptilian brain, and our body pumps a lot of adrenaline into our system. And as you know, the general reaction for that is to fight or flight or freeze, none of which are going to help you in a crucial conversation. And unfortunately, that blood being diverted to other parts of your brain means that your prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking and helping you work through a problem, is not getting all your resources. So just a brief note, sometimes you need to hit the pause button if you've unexpectedly entered a crucial conversation and you're in a heightened emotional state. Sometimes taking a moment to take a breather, take a break, is necessary for all those chemicals swimming around in your brain to kind of calm down and let you get back to a more reasonable state of mind. And sometimes it's good to let the other person have a chance to get to a reasonable state of mind. When I was a principal and dealing with upset students, a common strategy I had was to tell them I need to finish working on an email or messages or something. And, you know, a lot of times that was true, but sometimes I was just waiting for the student to calm down and get to a place where good communication could happen. So here are some things to keep in mind. And this part is about you. The first thing in the book that it really focuses on is you make you mad. And what it is about stories. That's why the slide's titled Master Your Stories. A lot of times we get upset by the things we tell ourselves why something's happening. If you're caught in a traffic jam and you're telling yourself if people would only be more cautious, if they didn't do this and that, you'd be on time and things like that. Those stories you're telling yourself are making you upset. So I know I dealt with a staff situation once where we were in a meeting, and afterwards they expressed opinion. And I asked them, you know, why didn't they share their ideas in the meeting? They were pretty good. And they said that they were afraid that they would be ridiculed and mocked if they said something by some of the other staff members. And even though that's not my own take on it, that is an example of a story. They had told themselves a story and they acted upon it. The other thing to keep in mind is our stories have a way of affecting our emotions. So if you're telling yourself that the reason somebody is doing something is because they want to control your behavior and they just delight in making sure that they keep you under their thumb, that's going to cause you to have feelings. And even if you're not choosing to have a crucial conversation, chances are your body language or other things will tell the person that you're not okay. And sometimes that's going to create a trust issue because then your body language and your words aren't lining up. So it's best to get your facts straight, decide to have a crucial conversation prior to your emotions deciding that you're going to have that conversation, whether you like it or not. Get back to the facts. A lot of times the stories we tell ourselves are designed to make us feel better about our choices. So if you take that example where the person chose to be quiet, they told themselves that if they talked, then they would be ridiculed and nobody would listen to them. And, that was probably based on some previous experience, but it wasn't a fact. It was something they told themselves to justify the fact that they didn't say anything in that context. So if you find yourself, you got loud and upset in a meeting, say a parent was being verbally abusive or something like that, and you started returning it, and then you find yourself saying they deserved it because of the way they were acting. They never listen. They won't listen unless I get loud. That is a signal that you're telling yourself a story to get yourself away from actual hard facts about what's going on, and that can kind of blind you to making good decisions. Own your own role. That's kind of related to get back to the facts. A lot of times when we tell ourselves that story, we call them victim stories or helpless story, that you don't really have a choice because of the situation. We kind of ignore our part in it. And so knowing how you're playing a role into it, maybe you've been sending a lot of messages, not allowing a lot of room for people to provide their input. And maybe that's why people are feeling stifled. And it doesn't mean you agree with that, but you kind of step out of trying to protect yourself, so to speak, defending yourself with stories and kind of asking yourself, is there missing pieces? Is there a way, as the bottom part says, a decent, rational person would do these things? So that's a part of just kind of stepping out and asking yourself, what's really going on here? And know what you hope to accomplish. A lot of times, due to that prefrontal cortex and diverting to the reptilian brain, we'll focus on the most obvious thing in front of us. So take somebody who's repeatedly late to work. We might want to talk about the most recent incident. And I'll talk about some of the pitfalls with that later, but the how they were late is not the why. So an example I gave in the book was a conversation between two spouses about, one wanting to go out to see a movie, one wanting to stay at home. Well, the going out to the movie and staying home are the things. They're not necessarily the why you want them. So what is it that you're hoping to accomplish? The other thing is, before you go into a conversation, if you're upset and you're trying to justify your behavior, you can have what I call the kitchen sink syndrome, or you can be on the receiving side of the kitchen sink syndrome from time to time. And so you want to just throw a host of issues at them, some of them not even related, and it gets you away from your goal. In fact, it can damage that attempt to try to salvage the conversation and get it to a good point. And the most likely thing that you'll get off track on is wanting to win the conversation. So instead of trying to figure out what's best for a student in an IEP meeting, you're trying to prove that you're right, that you're knowledgeable, that perhaps you feel disrespected and you're trying to prove that you're knowledgeable, for example. So you got to get back to yourself. Part of getting to know yourself too is being aware of what your triggers are when you've entered a crucial conversation. Do you tend to shut down? Do you get red? Do your sentences get clipped? Being familiar with what those are allows you to know that you've entered a state that is a crucial conversation and allows you to be more aware of what your tendencies are and to kind of have strategies to keep them in check so that you stay on course for what you want to achieve. So some guidelines. I talked a little bit about some of these in the previous slide, but what do you want to do before and during a crucial conversation? Now, if you have the time beforehand, work on you first. Are there details that you're skimming over because you're telling yourself a victim story or a helpless story where, this is the only way that it can be done, that you are simply on the receiving end of somebody who that you're telling yourself is merely getting up in the morning to make your life miserable? Step back, analyze those. Are those really, are you leaving out details to justify how you feel? And get familiar with what your actions might be. And previously when I did this, I said get familiar with like what your tendencies are, but also be aware that different situations you may have different tendencies. You might, later we'll talk about falling into silence where you shut down, but maybe in another context, you're more apt to amped up. It can vary depending on the circumstances. Focus on what you really want. If you're heading into a conversation, because, for example, you're doing an evaluation and the staff member is having a hard time and you want them to get on right with discipline, hitting them with a laundry list probably won't help them make any progress. So focus on what you're hoping to achieve. And refuse the fool's choice. That's what I was referring to as far as when you find yourself telling yourself, the only way that I can get through this person is if I get loud. The only way I can get through this situation is shut down. If you find yourself telling yourself that kind of thing, go back to one, why are you doing that? What are you trying to justify? The human brain is very good at trying to justify why it's doing what it's doing. And a lot of times it will inflate the consequences of something going awry, and it will minimize the rewards because you're trying to feel like what path you're on is the right one. So it may blind you from adjusting your behavior. So when you're in the crucial conversation, again, be aware of what signs that you're heading into a crucial conversation. What sort of warning signs you have. Maybe you get a tightness in your chest. Maybe your tone of voice changes. Be aware of the other person. Like, is there a shift that happens in the conversation? Or is the behavior a lot different than you expected coming into it? Because sometimes we don't realize that something's really important to somebody else until we're made aware of it. Make sure to analyze if safety is at risk. So if the person doesn't feel comfortable sharing their opinion, if they don't feel like it'll be listened to, you're not going to get very far with the crucial conversation. You need to first start with establishing this is a safe place to share an opinion, which means you may have to park your ego for a bit to listen to what's going on. You may have to listen to something you don't really care to for a bit to show that you're genuinely interested in hearing what their reasoning are and genuinely interested in understanding where they're coming from. Doesn't mean you agree, doesn't mean you'll do what they want, but if you're going to have honest dialogue, you have to show that you're willing to create a shared meaning, is what the book often refers to it as. And as I was talking about, be aware of your response under stress. So this slide is to stop and reflect. So just pause the video if you're watching it and just consider these questions about what are the stories you tell yourself to justify a fool's choice? Think of one of those scenarios and what facts did you add without supporting information? What sort of stories did you tell yourself? If you think to that situation that was generating the fool's choice, were there elements in that relationship that were missing, damaged, or absent? All right, if you're ready to move on, I will continue. So when you're moving into a crucial conversation, one of the hardest things to do is make sure you're paying attention to not just how you're delivering the message, but how it is being received. You watch for signs that maybe body language is not lining up with what is being said, or that the tone of voice is not lining up with the body language. So one example I like to use is I was having a meeting with a parent. They were calm, collected. However, they were turning a very bright shade of red. So I had to stop what I was talking about and tentatively ask, which we'll talk more about, what's on your mind? Tell me. And I had to use a strategy I'll get more into later in order to get them talking and to realize. But that signaled to me that something was not okay. Just a quick warning sign or warning on body language. Human beings are good at reading body language as signaling something's not lining up, but we're not always very good at reading the intent of it. So like, being able to tell somebody's lying from their body language, we can tell something's not lining up, but usually our ability to assess the exact reason why is a lot less reliable. So some things that people can descend into when they don't feel like there's safety there, or that they feel like they're personally under attack or vulnerable. A lot of people will fall into silence, and a lot of us have a tendency to typically fall into silence. But like I said, you might have situations where you're more prone to one or the other. For example, I know one of my touch points is if I feel like my ability to provide is at risk for like my family and stuff, I'm more prone to switch into the going on the offensive than silence. But most of the time, I do have a tendency to fall into silence. So masking is simply hiding your true emotions, saying that sounds like a wonderful idea, and slapping on a big fake smile when you really think this is the most stupid thing ever. I'm going to go back to my room and I'm going to continue to do it the way I think I need to do it, but I'm not going to sit here and argue with you. Avoiding is pretty simple, as an administrator, I've had the pleasure of walking down the street and watching somebody stop, move to the other side of the street, and continue. I'm not one that's never done that myself either, if I'm perfectly honest. Avoiding it can be changing topics. Instead of so you're talking to somebody about discipline, like I used before, and you go, well, how about the person next door? I hear like trying to divert the topic somewhere else, change the topic, just avoid it altogether. And withdrawing is just you stop sharing information. Maybe you say, yeah, sure. You quit adding to the shared meaning, as I said before. You're just kind of waiting it out, waiting for it to move on. So silence, one of the things to be careful of is if you're observing silence, particularly those ones where they're just kind of telling you, so to speak, they're going to go with the flow, go with whatever you decide, even though you can tell they're not okay with it. It can be tempting in those situations to barrel ahead, thinking, well, all right, we got an agreement, it's tentative. But this one can affect trust. So if you barrel ahead without taking a moment to say, oh, how do you really feel about this? To talk tentatively, to prime, to use some of the strategies we're going to talk about. If you don't stop to really kind of pull that opinion out of them, it can actually damage trust, because the story they'll begin to tell themselves is you really don't care, you just want their compliance. This is also, or I'll get into it with violence here. Violence is more when you go on the offensive. Controlling is like trying to coerce or force an opinion. Make sure that you're not falling into this. A controlling might be on a discipline. You might offer students rewards or punishment in order to encourage them to do one thing or another. The problem with those strategies is once those outside rewards or punishments leave, there's not really a motivation to stay on the same page. But, controlling might be going on a soapbox and monologuing to control where the conversation's going. I've seen it in board meetings where instead of making a decision, we're just going to table it, which is a little bit of avoiding, but like it's a way to control the conversation. Labeling is a strategy where you try to kind of dismiss what's being said by slapping a generalization, a stereotype on it. Those people over in that department don't know anything, so this idea is dumb. There's not really a reason there, and controlling uses a similar strategy. So like you might hear this strategy has been tried, or something like this has been tried at another school, but there's no real reasoning put behind it. Those things can be easy to find by if you start poking at it, there's really not a lot of substance there. And attacking is pretty straightforward, over like directly making threats that if you don't stop this conversation, I'm going to, veiled threats, those sorts of things. The danger point with violence is wanting to meet it with violence first off, to want to engage and go down that path of I want to win this conversation, and totally forgetting about what your objective is. Those strategies tend to get you emotionally ramped up pretty fast, and a lot of times you need to pause where the conversation is at and go back to analyzing the facts, the strategy, the relationship. You might have to take a break from the decision you're trying to make at that time, and to restore the safety. And there's times where sometimes you'll need to take a pause and come back to it. But for the purposes of this presentation, a lot of violence behavior, verbally in this context, is a sign of a lack of safety. And so you have to take a minute to step back and ask yourself why the conversation is going this way. So toolkits. So what are ways that you can tell the other person it's a safe place to share their opinion, that their opinion is wanted, that you're trying to create a shared understanding? And that's an idea I kind of want you to latch onto. You're trying to create a shared meaning first, and then we're going to proceed on. So apologize. So in that part where you're owning your own role, apologize for what role you may have in it. But careful, don't apologize for something you're not really meaning. Sorry I did that, I'm just that way, for example, means I'm sorry, but I'm not really sorry. And those sorts of strategies aren't really going to work. You have to really mean it. And so own your part in it. And this can make it okay for the other person by acknowledging that you have a part in the overall picture. Contrasting is a very powerful strategy, and it is best to use when the other person has perhaps assumed that you have an ill intent, or that they think X is going on when really Y is. You might say, I don't want to just punish your kid into compliance. I want them to get to a point where they make good choices, as an example. Like you give them you tell them what it is that they think is going on. The don't is really the important part, and then you provide what you do want. And that can be very important to kind of grease the wheels. And the first thing you try to do is establish what your mutual purpose is. And the book talks about a crib process, and it's really a strategy. So you need to recognize where your purposes intersect. Like I said, with school districts, typically it's pretty easy. You're trying to do what's best for the child. You're working with a parent, you're trying to help their child out. First, recognize where you have a mutual purpose. If necessary, you create one. Perhaps you're working on a classroom intervention, and instead of focusing on one issue, we go to a higher order. So for example, in that spousal one where one wants to go out, one wants to stay in, you both want to spend time together and grow your relationship. So you put the focus on that, and then you kind of backpedal. Invent, like if you go through those first two and you still don't have a mutual purpose, you might have to come up with areas in which they intersect. Like if you're dealing with a staff member who's really struggling, you might have to invent a mutual purpose where you're trying to, perhaps you've had to use a improvement plan, and it's like, I'm trying to get you to a point where you feel successful, and want to get to the point in the conversation where this is our shared purpose. And some situations are harder than others. Like I said, in schools, Once you've established that, the first part of that crib there, that this is our purpose, this is something we both agree on, then you start brainstorming how can we fulfill that purpose and, typically in this strategy meet both our needs. Like I said, sometimes it's more straightforward and sometimes it's more complicated. The more complex the issue is, the more down the inventive line you might have to go. One story I have of this is I one time sent a message out to staff, and to me, it was a pretty simple one. I thanked them for punching in early. And I received one message from a staff member that was relatively convinced that I was making a jab at them. And so I went down to talk to him, and I made an apology. I don't remember why, but just hey, if it was miscommunicated, that wasn't my intent. I kind of combined that with contrasting. And then I shared, my purpose is to make people feel appreciated. And that was the intent of the message. And, we feel appreciated, we better serve students. And moving on from there, I don't remember what their explanation was, but the contrasting was an important part of it. And we hit a good point using that strategy. And it wasn't something I expected to create a need for crucial conversation. So getting to know yourself inside the conversation, start with the facts. The facts, first off, are the least offensive things typically. I know sometimes we deal with invented facts these days, but start with facts. Something that I was trained in was documentation. And when I was trained to do that, I focused very much on facts of the matter. So kind of a tip on that, for example, you're dealing with a playground incident and somebody was mad and they threw a fit. Well, instead of writing they were mad, might say they started shake a little bit in their hands, they got bright red, and they swung a punch at Susie. Those things were observable facts. And you start with that, you kind of say, do we agree on these details? This is what I understand is going on. And start with the facts. That kind of leads into 3 a little bit. And 4, I'll come around to that. 2, tell your story. That's where these are the facts I know. This is how I'm interpreting them, kind of separating the two, like the things that we agree are going on. And then this is how I'm reading this information and the conclusions that I'm going towards. Ask for the other's path. So when you get through that, and sometimes you might bump 3 to where 2 is, or flop them around depending on how the conversation's going. You ask a person, are there details I'm missing? Am I interpreting it? How are you interpreting it? Or is there something I'm misinterpreting? And that's where the talk tentatively is. You make sure that you're presenting yourself in a curious way, like you're very neutral, you keep calm body language, and you say, what do you think of that? You keep inviting them to add to the meeting. You're wanting them to help add understanding. Encourage testing, and that's kind of part of the tentatively, but ending it with, does that sound fair to you? Does that sound accurate? Am I missing anything? So example of where I use this in a crucial conversation is I had a situation where I had to pull in a staff member, and I started with the facts. It seems like you're referring students to the counselor for the purpose of utilizing the I got back up. You sent so-and-so to the counselor. When they were there, they got asked questions about the principal, and then you sent so-and-so and so-and-so. This is, nobody referred them. This is the information in front of me. And in this situation, I said, how would you interpret this information? And in this particular crucial conversation, the person asked, are you accusing me of something? I said, no, I'm not accusing you of anything. These are the facts of the matter. Do I have these wrong? And the answer was no. And I didn't jump into my story in this situation because I was also doing kind of an investigation. But it's like, if you had this information in front of you, what would you think? And the end result was the person actually quit the next day. Hopefully you amend the relationship and things like that. But we didn't get into a shouting match. We didn't get into an argument about what happened. She recognized that a reasonable person looking at the same information as I was going to have questions. And they elected, instead of facing those questions, to be done with your job. So a good example of a place where I use that. Explore the other's path. Now, the easiest way is to just ask. How do you see this? What's your story? Sometimes you kind of bounce between the two depending on how the conversation is. But sometimes asking is not enough to get the information from. And I'd actually like to add that typically, if it's really a crucial conversation, asking is only a starting point, because typically, unless you have a pretty good rapport and you have those relationship elements, a lot of times asking won't be enough for them to tell you what's going on. So mirror. There's two types of mirroring in this situation. There's one that's like about owning yourself. So if you're in a crucial conversation, you want to mirror the behavior you want to see. You want to have a calm disposition, even tone, that sort of thing. But mirror, when you're exploring the other person's path, is to tell them what you're seeing. So if we rewind to my parent example where the person was turning bright red, I paused the conversation and I said, "Sir, you are turning a bright shade of red. I don't believe you are okay." And by pointing that out, we were able to start talking about what was making him upset. And this is most useful when you see like body language not lining up. And what you're doing is you just tell them what you're observing. Perhaps you end it with, "I think there's more to say. I think something's bothering you. It looks like something's bothering you." And then you kind of invite them to tell what's going on. Paraphrase is more after you hear what they've said, what they say their story is. You repeat it back, but make very sure that you do it in your own words. And the reason for that is you want to make sure you understand. If you just parrot it back to them, A, it can seem insincere or condescending, but B, it won't really tell you if you've gotten the right message. Because sometimes you use the same word, has two different meanings, that sort of thing. Prime is a strategy you won't always necessarily have to use, but is particularly useful when the other person has shut down. The term comes from prime the pump, if you're familiar with the old systems where you had to use the handle on the old well to get the pump primed. So you might be in a situation where you can see from the body language that something's wrong. And when you ask, they're not saying anything. And so you offer your best explanation. So the most recent example I used of this is I mirrored, I said, "I can see that you're upset. You have water in your eyes. You seem tense. And you're slightly shaking. Are you having would it be fair to say that you're having some stress working with a colleague?" And in this situation, it got them to tell me that, yes, it's stressful. They didn't want to go into details and they swore me not to talk about it. But I got them talking about what it was bothering them. The caveat with prime is if you're going to use it, you have to be willing to listen to what the person says, because it might not be something you want to hear. We're not talking to you because you don't really want to listen. We've been down this path before. You gather our input, then you do whatever you want. You might have to provide that explanation, and they might add more on top of it. And you have to keep that calm disposition, that openness. You're trying to both understand each other. Doesn't mean you agree, but you sincerely want to get the person talking. That's what these strategies are for. This is to repair broken relationships, is to get an understanding between each other and to move to a better place. So stop and reflect. Think of a possible crucial conversation. write a contrasting statement you might use to kind of get the conversation going, to get it to a better understanding. Identify the facts in the conversation and think of questions to tentatively ask for information. So if you look at the facts, does there appear to be things that are missing, and how would you try to get that information? So the person has shut down. How do you restore that sense of safety? Perhaps use a prime strategy. Perhaps it's the talk tentatively, moving a lot back and forth. Kind of work yourself through a crucial conversation, maybe one you recently had or one that you're expecting to have. And just pause the video and restart it when you've gotten some answers. So just kind of wrapping up the presentation a little bit, getting into the last stretch. I want to put a little emphasis on agree where you agree. I've kind of been sprinkling that out through the presentation if you kind of listen between the lines. But sometimes when we get caught up with winning or we get emotional, we can turn a situation where we agree on 95% of the things and turn it into argument. I remember we had one staff meeting where we were talking about, I believe, a reading incentive program. And I had taken the time to survey the staff members about all the topics, about what they agree with, what they disagree with. And then I actually provided that to them because they knew it would be a tense topic because people get pretty passionate about this thing. And I know this one staff member had like a speech prepared. They had this whole triad that they were going to go on about the importance of this or that. I don't remember exactly what it was. I never actually did hear it because when I shared that these are all the things we already agree on, she realized a lot of the things she had to say weren't necessary. So we could focus on the 5% of what we were disagreeing on. It's also part of that fact part. In that first stage where you're saying these are the details, these are the facts, make sure you agree on that. If you're going through the scenario and say it's like that playground issue where this and that happened, establish those areas where everybody agrees this happened. And then you've narrowed it down to those things that we disagree on. Because sometimes we can spend so much time arguing about something that we already agree on that we never actually get to the 5% we disagree. And history is a great example of situations where wars were started between two groups of people who really agreed on the grand majority of things, but on this one particular issue, they could not come to a resolution. And I'll get more into the middle one here, but remember that dialogue is not decision making. First off, it can take a lot of energy to have a crucial conversation, to work through all that mental process. You probably don't want to be having it, all the time, because the purpose of these strategies is to mend the relationship, to better understand each other, and you'll probably come up with solutions. But if you don't take the time to identify who's making a decision, which I'll get into, or what's going to happen because of the conversation, it can feel like a monumental waste of time. A good example I have of this is at one of the previous districts where I was a principal. I got it suggested to me that we drop our RTI, response to intervention program, which kind of threw me at the time. I'm like, well, why would you want to do that? And the reason was very logical. They said, all we do is talk about things, but we never actually do anything. And that was a legitimate complaint. And I took that and we did some stuff to make sure that we didn't go down that road and talking the issue to death. That's where pay attention to follow through is. The book on crucial accountability kind of goes all the way into this and different strategies. But like the main thing is to be very specific for this presentation on when, where, who. If you need a timeline, the higher degree of high stakes and emotion involved, the more clear you need to be. Saying things like done eventually is a trap, because like done eventually is an open to interpretation. And so when you go back to that person and I said, I thought we agreed that we'd get this report done. You're like, we did eventually. That creates room for misunderstanding and unmet expectations that could have maybe been solved by just being very clear of what we expect. All right, so when you hit that part where you need to make a decision And it's important to know these sort of facts. So the little graphic feeds into which one you choose. So who cares about the decision being made? Which is not always the same as who knows. Who has important information? Kind of wedged in between those are who does that decision directly affect? Who's generally who cares, but sometimes you have people that care about the decision that aren't necessarily directly affected. But who does it affect? Who has information that will inform the decision? Who must agree? So if you're doing a initiative, say revamping your professional development program, who do you need all on board for it to be successful? And how many people is it worth involving? Sometimes having too many cooks in the kitchen results in not being able to make a decision. So when you're having crucial conversation, particularly if it ends up being with a group of people and you're trying to make a decision, say on a curriculum initiative or a discipline overhaul, you have to ask yourself these questions. These are best to ask beforehand, before things get muddled otherwise. But there's 4 general ways a decision can be made. Command is best used. If you remember back in COVID, I used command to tell staff we're going to distance learning because it wasn't a choice. I'm simply telling them what I got handed. And if I told them, would you like to go to distance learning, that would be disingenuous and would actually likely harm the relationship because there really isn't a decision there. And command can also happen where you reach that crucial conversation and you turn the ultimate decision over to somebody else. But they get to decide. Perhaps they have more knowledge or something like that. But be careful not to do that in a way that makes people think you just don't care. Like, this decision isn't important to me, so I'm going to give it to Susie. Susie can decide what will happen, and we'll go along with that. If particularly of those of us who are in authority or in a position, if the decision is really resting on you to decide, then you need to decide. This is particularly true in situations where you need to decide what works. You have to do this way because you're going to need to achieve this goal. And so there isn't a whole lot of room for options. Consult is one that a lot of us use quite frequently. I use it quite a bit with school calendars. I'll send out a survey. Here's your input. But it's very important to make sure people understand which strategy you're using. So a lot of times when I send out my survey asking for input for the calendar, it comes with, this is not a vote. If people think you're doing one strategy and you do something else that can harm trust, consult is a great strategy where ultimately one person has to make the decision. Perhaps they don't have all the information, and perhaps that decision is going to affect a lot of other people. But it's not necessary that everybody agree on it, and involving more people won't necessarily give you any benefit. Vote's great when you need a lot of agreement, but you don't need everybody on board. You just need kind of a majority approval. Perhaps other people will come along the way, or that sort of thing. Careful with consensus. It can be really great when you can achieve it. I had one staff meeting where we reached a consensus on the next curriculum to implement, and that was great. Very high implementation, a lot of fidelity. But I had another one where we had to go through kind of a crucial conversation, and I had to ask myself, who must agree? So I knew I couldn't get everybody to agree to the same thing. So we agreed to the one that most of us could accept. And I put the focus on there, and I didn't even agree with that particular decision because, but like if I had gone to the other curriculum that myself and another staff member had wanted, I knew that I wouldn't have enough people on board and it would undermine the implementation. And it was more important that I had everybody on the same page. So when you get through with the crucial conversation, if there's a decision that needs to be made, very much understand which type of decision that you're making here and use these 4 elements to determine which one is the most appropriate. And if you're the one that needs to make a decision, make sure you make the decision. If somebody else is more suited, make sure you identify that. So some caveats. These are strictly my own thoughts on it, and I added, but these are kind of 3 times that I know that having the crucial conversation can be really difficult. And these strategies still work, but these are situations in which maybe they're going to test your skills a little bit more, or that you have to back up and focus on something else first. So when the desire to win becomes the objective. So if you're dealing with somebody, or you need to look inside and see if that's what you've started to do. If they lost sight of the, we're trying to help kids, we're trying to balance the budget, whatever it is, and it's like, I need to be right. My objective is to prove you wrong, and I don't really care about anything else. If you're dealing with that type of situation with somebody, having crucial conversation can be really hard unless you can get them back to what the real purpose was. If you can get them, this isn't about me and you, we're trying to achieve this. And most people can be redirected, but there are situations in which a person becomes more fixated on the winning aspect. And sometimes that makes it hard for the crucial conversation to be successful. The relationship needs repair. If you go back to those first 4, if the sense of disrespect is so high that there's no sense of safety, like it's going to take more than a couple of conversations to restore that, and you might have to do some other things. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where damage has been done. Again, these strategies can be helpful. I'm not saying they're not, but these are some situations in which they might not be enough by themselves. And when things turn to adversarial tactics, I have another presentation called Courage Under Fire, which is based on surviving the school leader's dunk tank. But sometimes you find yourself in a situation where perhaps momentum has built towards, say, that you become the target of, we want to see you out. And people start doing things like withholding information, spreading false information, gathering allies. That presentation goes more into that. But sometimes it becomes a situation where you need to prioritize protecting yourself and protecting your integrity, your mental health. And sometimes that puts that crucial conversation of a shared meaning. Like if you can get there, that's great. But there are times where you need to protect yourself and take care of yourself first. Because go back to it, you focus on you first. If you are not in a good state of mind, if you're not in a healthy place, chances are you're going to struggle to have this type of conversation. So just a recap here as I get to the end of it, and I apologize there. I currently work for Long Prairie Gray Eagle, and I am the superintendent there. My email is dludvigson@lpge.k12.mn.us. So just recap, work on you first. Make sure that you're in a good state of mind, that you have your facts, that you understand what stories you might be telling yourself, which bleeds into master your stories. Realize what you're telling yourself, realize where you may be missing things, realize where you may be contributing to stuff, because those are the things you can control. You focus on things you can't control, you're going to feel the victim story of that you're helpless, that you can't do anything about it, so that you might as well shut down or whatever the case is. Create that sense of safety. So I kind of can add this to the caveat. So if people aren't used to crucial conversations, if they're not used to being invited to share their opinion, it's going to take a while before they genuinely believe that that's what's going to happen, that you really honestly care. I remember one student who I had in my office several times, and he'd always start like this, and I'd use the mirroring, hey, looks like you don't really want to talk. And I would tell him things like, no, I know you think that I've already made a decision that you're guilty, but I have not. And I generally want to hear your side of the story. And I use these strategies, and eventually he believed me. I had another student too where I said, well, my objective is to learn what happened, and I'll make a fair decision. You've interacted with me with enough times where if you're at fault, we'll deal with that. If you're not, we'll move on from there. And getting to that trust level, particularly sometimes if you enter an organization where it's not there, it might take you some time to get to that point where people really trust the process. Share your path. Make sure that you can use that strategy of, these are the things I know, this is how I'm interpreting it, and to keep open to what their path is. They ask them how they are seeing things, and to keep the focus on that shared meaning. That's really the big concept in the book. You're both trying to talk something through, to understand each other, and from that point, we're trying to make a decision. And so with that, I very much thank you for your time and choosing to watch this presentation, and in particular, if you stopped and did the reflections. And with that, I hope these skills help serve you in the next time you hit a crucial conversation.